My name is Alan. I'm 34 years old now, but this happened when I was 26. It was late September 2017. I was living in Cincinnati at the time, working a regular warehouse job. Nothing special, just loading and unloading trucks, stacking boxes, cleaning up messes. I'd been doing it for 4 years and didn't really have a plan to do much else. My life wasn't exciting, but it was steady. I like things to stay simple. That's just how I've always been. Everything changed when I got a letter in the mail one morning. It was from a law firm in Arkansas. I didn't know anyone there, but when I opened it, I found out that my grandfather had passed away. His name was Harold. I hadn't seen him in about 10 years. He used to live in the mountains out in Newton County, not far from Jasper. I remember visiting him once as a kid with my parents. He had this wooden cabin buried deep in the forest. No neighbors for miles, just trees and dirt roads. He lived completely off the grid. No internet, no cell service, no running water half the time. That trip stuck with me because of how quiet it was out there. Uncomfortably quiet, but he seemed to like it that way. The letter said he left the cabin to me in his will. I was the only grandchild he had. My dad died years ago, and my mother moved to Oregon and didn't keep in touch much after that. I guess Harold didn't have anyone else. The lawyer told me I needed to go down there to sign some papers and get the keys. It wasn't really a decision I thought too hard about. I didn't want to leave the cabin just sitting there empty, and I figured I could maybe fix it up and sell it, or at least check it out and decide what to do later. I packed up my old Ford and took a week off work. I brought some clothes, tools, a cooler full of food, some water jugs, and my dog Murphy. He's a big yellow lab, always follows me around, never barks unless something's really wrong. I figured the fresh air would do us both good. The drive took about 10 hours. I remember the roads getting smaller and bumpier the closer I got. Cell service vanished halfway into the mountains. The GPS cut out, and I had to rely on an old printed map the lawyer mailed me. The last few miles were just winding dirt trails barely wide enough for the truck. I finally reached the cabin around 6 in the evening. The sun was going down. It looked exactly like I remembered, but older, more worn out. The wood was gray and splintered. The windows were clouded over. Moss covered most of the roof. The place looked like no one had touched it in years. I parked the truck next to a rusted-out shed and let Murphy out. He sniffed around for a bit, then sat down and stared at the front door like he was waiting for me to go inside first. There was a big old padlock on the door, but I had the key. Took some twisting, but it opened. The door creaked loud when I pushed it in. The air inside was heavy and smelled like old wood and dust. I didn't turn on any lights because there weren't any. My grandfather used lanterns and a generator when he needed power. The inside was one big room with a bed in the corner, a stove, some shelves, and a table. The place was filled with dust, old tools, jars of preserved food, and stacks of newspaper. I noticed an old hunting rifle above the door. Everything looked like it hadn't been touched in years. I set my stuff down and started unpacking. I lit one of the oil lanterns and opened the windows to air the place out. Murphy stuck close to me. He kept sniffing the corners like he was trying to find something. I figured animals probably came in at some point. I didn't see anything alive, but I saw rat droppings and some chewed up paper in the back corner. That first night I couldn't sleep much. It was too quiet. I wasn't used to that kind of silence. No cars, no people, not even bugs. Just wind moving through the trees. I laid in the creaky bed under some old blankets and listened to Murphy breathing on the floor beside me. At one point, around 3 a.m., he lifted his head and growled low. Not barking, just the steady rumble in his chest. I sat up, heart pounding, and looked toward the windows. I couldn't see anything, just blackness. No moon that night. I grabbed the flashlight and stepped outside with Murphy. He didn't bolt, just stood beside me, ears up, eyes fixed on the woods. I scanned the trees, but nothing moved. After a while, he relaxed. I went back in and eventually fell asleep around dawn. The next day, I spent time cleaning up the place. I opened the shed and found a bunch of old tools, a chainsaw, extra jugs of fuel, and stacks of firewood. The generator was there too, dusty and half covered with a tarp. I cleaned it up and got it running after a few pulls. It gave me enough power for the lights and to charge my phone a bit, but still no signal. I tried climbing up a nearby ridge to get a bar, but nothing. That second night was quieter. Murphy slept calmly. I thought maybe he'd just heard a raccoon or something the night before. But when I woke up on the third morning and went outside, I saw something strange. There were boot prints in the dirt near the side of the cabin. Not mine. Mine were still fresh near the truck, and I always walked around in sneakers. These were heavy tread, deep like work boots. They led from the tree line to the back of the cabin and then disappeared around the edge of the woods. I looked around, called out even though I knew no one would answer. Murphy was pacing now, nose to the ground. He followed the tracks for a few feet and stopped. His ears went back. He wouldn't go further. That unsettled me. I kept telling myself it was nothing. Maybe some hunter wandered through. Maybe someone used to check on the place. Still, I loaded the rifle with some old ammo I found in the shed and kept it by the door, just in case. That evening, I went down the path behind the cabin. It was overgrown but still walkable. I remembered walking it with my dad when I was a kid. It led to a small stream where we used to fish. I hadn't been back since that one trip. When I got there, I found a small clearing and a few old folding chairs set up around a fire pit, all covered in leaves and moss. But what caught my eye was a half-burned pile of cloth off to the side. I went closer and saw that it was old clothing. Torn up jeans, a jacket, and what looked like a sleeping bag, half charred. It looked recent. Not brand new, but not 10 years old either. Something about that didn't sit right with me. I didn't touch it. I just backed away and returned to the cabin. That night, I didn't sleep. I kept the lights off and sat at the window with the rifle. Murphy stayed close, barely moved. Around 2 a.m., I heard something outside. Not footsteps. It was a dragging sound, like something heavy being pulled over the ground. I turned off the lantern and waited. Murphy started growling again, same low rumble. I opened the door quietly and stepped out onto the porch. The dragging sound had stopped. I couldn't see anything, but I could feel something wasn't right. I heard a branch snap in the woods, maybe 30 feet out, then nothing. The next morning, I found more boot prints. These ones came right up to the back door. I hadn't even heard that. Whoever it was, they were watching us. I packed my things that day. I'd only planned to stay a few more nights, but I'd had enough. The place gave me a bad feeling. I left some of the food and tools, loaded Murphy into the truck, and started driving out. The dirt road felt longer this time. I kept checking the mirror. About 10 minutes down the trail, I saw something off to the side. A little opening in the trees. Looked like someone had been living there. Tarp over a branch, some bags, even a fire pit. I didn't stop. I just drove on. I made it back to town, called the law office, and told them I wasn't going to keep the cabin. I signed the papers and handed it over to the county. I don't know what they did with it. To this day, I don't know who was out there. Maybe someone had been squatting in the woods. Maybe more than one person. My grandfather always said people out there kept to themselves. But some people, they don't want to be found. I've never gone back. Murphy lived another 4 years before passing away. He was a good dog, kept me safe out there. Sometimes I wonder how long someone had been staying behind the cabin. If my grandfather ever knew. If maybe that's why he left the place to me. Or maybe it was just a bad coincidence. All I know is there's something about deep, empty woods that changes people. It's not ghosts or monsters. It's just what people become when no one's watching. I I still have dreams about that night, the dragging sound, the footprints by the door, the fire pit in the clearing. In the dreams, I go back, and every time, the cabin is open, the door swinging in the wind, and someone is waiting inside. But that's just in the dreams, and I don't plan on going back to check, ever. It was late October 2017 when I got the email from a guy named Steve Harrell, a senior park ranger in charge of maintaining portions of Bitter Rock National Forest up in western Idaho. I had met him briefly the previous summer during a volunteer fire watch program. He was quiet, hard to read, but seemed to appreciate people who showed up and didn't complain. I guess I made some kind of impression because now, for months later, he was asking if I could come back for a few days to help him with end-of-season trail cleanup and some work around one of the old ranger cabins. I wasn't working much at the time, just bouncing between small handyman jobs, and I liked being out there in the mountains more than being stuck in town. It sounded simple enough, 3 or 4 days of hauling down trail signs, repairing a shutter or two, and making sure the main generator still worked before winter storms rolled in. He said I'd have the south cabin to myself and could bring my own food, gear, and whatever else I wanted. I had no reason to say no. I packed up the next morning. The drive took nearly 4 hours, most of it on highways, and the last 45 minutes were along a gravel road with cliffs on one side and forest stretching out endlessly on the other. I passed 2 deer, a mangled old road sign that had fallen over, and then finally a locked yellow gate with a keypad that Steve had given me the code to. The gate groaned when I pushed it open and clanked shut behind me as I drove through. Past it, the road turned narrower, more like a fire access trail than a real road. My Tacoma's tires bounced hard on rocks and ruts, and I had to slow down to a crawl in places. Then finally, after another 15 minutes of low-range crawling, the ranger's cabin came into view through a row of thinning pines. It sat about 30 yards off the trail, surrounded by a clearing full of dead needles and brush. It was built in the 1960s, dark brown timber siding, a sloped roof with metal sheeting, and a wraparound porch with a few warped boards. One of the cabin's side windows was boarded up, and I could see the green utility shed tucked behind it. There was no other building for miles around, just that one little cabin. I parked and got out. The air smelled of cold pine, dry moss, and something faintly musty, like the woods had started to rot with the season changing. I stepped up onto the porch and pulled out the key Steve had left in a rusted metal box under the step. The lock took a little force to turn, but the door swung open after a hard nudge. Inside, it was exactly what I expected. Spartan but functional. One main room with a cot, a wooden table, a propane stove, a shelf of old ranger maps, a narrow hall leading to a tiny bathroom with a dry toilet, and not much else. There was no heat except for a cast iron stove in the corner that hadn't been used in years. I opened the windows to get the stale air out and started hauling my stuff inside. By the time I finished unpacking my food, gear, and sleeping bag, the sun had already dipped behind the hills. I heated up a can of soup on the propane burner and ate at the table while reading one of the old park logs that had been left behind. Mostly boring notes, trail reports, wildlife sightings, a few maintenance entries from 2008 and 2009. The last real log entry was dated 4 years ago, talking about storm damage and repairs needed for the trail signs up near Pine Ridge. That's the same trail Steve had told me I'd be helping with. That night, I went to bed early. I kept my headlamp next to the cot and a hatchet near the door out of habit. It got cold fast. I remember laying in the dark, the kind of still silence that only deep woods can bring, and hearing nothing at all except the soft creak of the wood beams adjusting to the temperature drop. I closed my eyes and drifted off around 9:30. Somewhere after midnight, I woke up. Not to a noise exactly, but something, a feeling. It's hard to describe. The kind of sensation you get when someone walks into the room while your back is turned. How the air just subtly shifts. That was what hit me. I didn't move at first. I just opened my eyes and looked up at the cabin's ceiling. Dark wood panels with a faint beam of moonlight coming in through the front window. I turned onto my side and looked toward the door. Nothing. No shadows moving.
No strange sounds.
Still, I got up. Quietly, I grabbed the hatchet and stepped to the window. I looked out into the dark clearing, where the trees stood still like statues under the moonlight. Everything looked normal, but that feeling hadn't gone away. I stood there for a long while, just listening. Finally, I chalked it up to being alone in an unfamiliar place and went back to bed. I didn't sleep well the rest of that night. The next morning, I started work early. Steve had left a folder in the shed with printed instructions, locations of broken signs, trail markers to be pulled, and places where washed-out sections needed photos. I strapped on my pack, loaded it with tools, and headed toward Pine Ridge. It was slow, hard work, hiking up uneven switchbacks with a heavy pack. The wind up there was biting, and the trees had already started dropping their needles. It was beautiful, but also dead quiet. I didn't see another person the entire time, which I expected. Still, something about the forest felt off. Not dangerous, just watchful. I found 2 of the trail signs that needed pulling. One was snapped at the base, probably wind damage. The other was tagged with spray paint, just a crude letter F, and an arrow pointing toward an unmarked direction off the trail. I took photos and noted it for removal. That felt strange, but I figured maybe some teenagers had gotten up here at some point in summer. By the time I got back to the cabin that evening, it was nearly dark again. I was muddy, tired, and my knees ached. I made some coffee, heated a meal, and sat out on the porch as the sun dipped low and the temperature dropped again. That's when I saw the first real sign something wasn't right. Near the tree line, maybe 50 or 60 yards out, I spotted something pale against the shadows. I stood up and narrowed my eyes. It was a plastic bag, like the kind you'd get from a gas station, fluttering in the wind, snagged on a bush. I thought that was odd. This wasn't exactly a place where people came often. I hadn't seen any trash yesterday. I left it alone, figuring I'd hike over in the morning and pick it up. That night, I locked the door and left my hatchet next to the bed again. I slept on and off, waking up to the same eerie stillness. At one point, I thought I heard something on the porch, a creak, just one. Then silence again. I held my breath in the dark and waited. My heart thumped in my ears, but nothing else happened. The next morning, I went out to find the plastic bag. It was gone. In its place, stuck to the branch, was a strip of red cloth, like a ripped piece of flannel. It looked new. I took it down and looked around the area. No footprints, no other trash, just that strip. Now I was starting to feel nervous. I brought the cloth back inside and left it on the table. That day, I worked closer to the cabin, doing minor repairs on the porch boards and checking the shed wiring. I didn't want to wander far. While I worked, I kept checking the woods, like my eyes were drawn to them. I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was nearby. I didn't see anything all day, but when I went back inside to make food that evening, I found something I couldn't explain. The red cloth I'd left on the table was gone. I didn't hear anyone, didn't see the door open, but it was gone. That night, I barely slept at all. I sat up in bed most of the time, hatchet in my lap, listening. Once, around 3 a.m., I thought I heard a soft tapping on the wall outside. Not banging, not knocking, just a faint tap, 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 like a single finger touching wood. I didn't go outside. I just sat there until the sun finally came up. When it did, I opened the door to find something else. On the porch, just outside the door, was a small pile of rocks, stacked carefully. 5 smooth stones, each about the size of a fist, arranged in a little tower. Someone had made that during the night. That was it. I wasn't sticking around another night. I packed my gear fast. Food, tools, maps, everything back into the truck by 9 a.m. I left the cabin key on the table and locked the door. As I backed out of the clearing and turned the truck around, I looked back one more time. Just at the edge of the trees, barely visible, I saw a figure. Not moving, just standing still, dressed in dark clothes, face turned toward me, too far to make out any features. I didn't stop. I didn't wait to see if they moved. I just drove. The whole way down that access road, I kept checking the rearview mirror. I never saw another car.
No hikers.
Nothing. I called Steve when I got into town and told him there was something strange up at that cabin. He didn't say much, just thanked me and said he'd send someone else to check it out. I never heard from him again, and I never went back. Even now, years later, I still don't know what I saw or who was up there. But I know this. Something was watching me, following me, testing the edge of fear without ever crossing into open threat. That's what made it worse, because it wasn't random. It was personal, and it wasn't over until I left. I hadn't been back to that part of Oregon in almost 12 years. When Lisa died, the first thing I did after getting the call was shut my phone off and sit at the edge of my bed, just staring at the floor. The second thing I did later that evening was pull out the old folder she'd mailed to me 6 years earlier, the one I never opened. I didn't know why I did it. Maybe because she was gone now, and I didn't have to be afraid of her voice showing up in my head while I read whatever was in there. Inside was a deed, a couple of old letters, just plain paper folded in thirds, and the keys to the old place. That small wooden cabin out past Crooked River Ranch, the one she had fixed up on her own after we split up. I knew the place from photos. I had never set foot in it. She'd always talked about wanting to disappear into nature and build her own quiet space where no one could tell her what to do. I always assumed that was her way of telling me I had tried to control her too much. Truth is, maybe I had. She left the cabin to me. I didn't want it. I didn't want anything that had her name on it. But I also couldn't just leave it sitting out there, abandoned and forgotten. Some part of me, I don't know what, felt like I needed to see it. Not to mourn her, not to make peace with anything, just to know. So the week after her funeral, I loaded up my truck with some clothes, my old hiking boots, a toolbox, a basic first aid kit, and a couple boxes of food. I didn't plan on staying long. Maybe just enough time to clean the place up, look around, decide whether to sell it or maybe just burn it to the ground. I wasn't sure. It was early September 2023 when I drove into that forest, dirt and gravel crunching under my tires, the sun already dipping behind the tall pines, the air turning sharp with cold the higher up I got. The cabin was deep in, almost an hour off the main road. No cell service, no other houses, no power lines in sight. I passed a couple of signs that looked so faded I couldn't read them anymore. Some were leaning sideways, some half-eaten by moss and rot. The path narrowed the deeper I went, branches scraping the sides of the truck, dust rising behind me like a cloud. When I finally saw the edge of the roof peeking out behind a wall of trees, I pulled the truck to a stop and just sat there for a minute, the engine ticking as it cooled. My hands didn't want to move. I felt this pressure in my chest, not sadness, not even anger, just this cold, sick kind of resistance, like I was about to do something I couldn't undo. The cabin looked exactly like her. Not in the literal sense, of course, but in the way it stood, quiet and plain, refusing to fall apart. The siding was old but well kept. The small porch was built out of thick redwood planks, no paint, just natural grain. A small chimney poked out the side. There was even a little wooden chair near the door. It looked like she had sat there often. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The smell hit me first. Old wood, dried herbs, a bit of mildew, and something else, something faintly chemical. I couldn't place it at the time. The place had clearly been untouched for months. Dust coated everything. The light from the windows stretched out across the floor in long golden lines. There was no electricity, of course. Just a wood stove in the corner, a small counter with a sink, and a few open shelves stacked with jars. In the far corner was a narrow bed, neatly made. There were 2 windows, one facing the clearing and the other looking out into the dense forest. I walked through slowly, checking everything. Felt like stepping into someone else's skin. Her presence was still here in every object, every little handmade curtain, every damn stick of furniture. I opened drawers and found utensils wrapped in twine, old notebooks, a tiny box of seed packets. Nothing was out of place. She had lived here full time. I could tell. I made a small fire in the stove and sat down on the edge of the bed, listening to the pop and crackle of the pine logs. The silence was thicker than I remembered from other places. It had weight to it, like it filled up the corners of the room. I stayed the night. The bed was too small for me, and I woke up twice to the sound of something moving outside. I didn't panic. I'd camped enough to know the sounds of deer, squirrels, even the occasional bear. I still grabbed the knife I kept next to me and stood at the window both times, just to be sure. The second day, I started exploring the property. Behind the cabin was a narrow path that led down to a small creek. The water was cold and fast. There was a small bench she had built there too, looking out over the rocks. Felt private, peaceful even. But something about it made my skin crawl. Not from fear exactly, more like I was trespassing. Like I wasn't supposed to see these pieces of her. Later that afternoon, I found the shed. It was tucked behind a thicket of brush, almost hidden. A single wooden door, no windows. The lock had rusted shut. I got my crowbar from the truck and forced it open. Inside was a single metal chair, an old work table, and shelves stacked with cans and tools. There were traps, ropes, axes. A small red generator sat in the corner, covered in dust. On the far wall was a pegboard with neatly hung tools. And in the corner, beneath a tarp, was a metal drum. Something about the drum made me stop. I walked over slowly, the floor creaking under my boots. I pulled the tarp off and stared at it. Just a regular 55-gallon drum. But the lid was bolted shut with heavy clips. I didn't open it that day. That night, I had trouble sleeping. I kept hearing something. At first, I thought it was the wind, but it didn't move the trees. It didn't whistle. It was softer, like something brushing against wood. I heard it twice, both times around 3 in the morning. A slow, deliberate scraping sound, like nails on the wall. Not loud, but close, too close. I waited, knife in hand, back to the wall. It stopped after a minute.
No footsteps. No branches snapping.
Just silence again. The next morning, I walked around the cabin looking for marks. I didn't find any scratches on the outside walls. No broken branches. But about 20 feet into the woods behind the shed, I found something strange. The grass was flattened, like someone had been sitting or lying there. Perfect oval shape. No fire pit, no signs of animals. Just a dent in the earth. And a boot print. A single one. It wasn't mine. I wear size 12s. This one was smaller. Maybe a size 9.
Narrow heel.
Deep tread. It was fresh. I followed the tracks for maybe 50 feet before they vanished into the moss. That afternoon, I opened the drum. Took me an hour to get the bolts off. I used a wrench from the shed and had to soak them in oil first. My hands were shaking a little. I don't know why. It was just a drum. But when I cracked the lid, the smell that came out made me gag. It was chemical, thick, sharp, like paint thinner and death. Inside were dozens of sealed plastic bags, ziplocked, labeled with dates. Most were filled with papers, old bills, notes, receipts. but some held things I didn't understand. Pieces of fabric, strands of hair tied with thread, tiny vials of some liquid. One bag held what looked like a roll of photographs, tightly rubber banded. I took it out and unrolled it. Every photo was of me, not all recent, some from years ago, one from my old apartment in Portland, one from a trip I took to Denver, a few from my job site, all from a distance, through windows, across streets, behind cars. Somebody had been watching me. I dropped the photos and backed away. My heart was racing. I looked around the shed, suddenly feeling like I was being watched again. I felt exposed, violated. I never knew she'd been following me, if it was her, but something told me she wasn't alone in this. I stayed up that night with a flashlight and a hammer in my lap. I heard the scraping again, but this time it was on the roof. I ran outside, shining the light upward. Nothing. No tracks. No movement. Just trees swaying slightly. My own breath fogging the cold air. The next morning, I packed my truck. I didn't care about the cabin. I didn't want to know more. But just before I got in the truck, I noticed something on the front porch. A single photo. It hadn't been there the night before. It was one of me from that morning, standing at the creek behind the cabin. I left without locking the door. I didn't call the police. I didn't tell anyone. I kept the photo. I keep it in a drawer at home, just so I can remind myself it was real, that someone was up there, someone who still might be watching, maybe someone she knew, maybe someone who took over after she was gone. Whatever secrets Lisa had, I don't want to know them anymore, and I never want to go back to that cabin again. I was 34 years old the year I found the cabin. It was the summer of 2019, and I had just quit my job in Chicago. Things were falling apart at the time. My long-term relationship had ended the previous winter. I was burned out from years in the logistics industry, and everything in my apartment felt like it belonged to someone else. I needed to disappear for a while. Not forever, just long enough to get my head straight. I had a friend, a guy I went to college with, who lived in Idaho. His name was Brian, and he had a house in a small town called Grangeville. He worked from home and had an old camper he wasn't using anymore. I called him up, explained that I needed to get away, and he offered to let me borrow the camper and take it out into the wilderness for a few weeks. 2 weeks later, I was parked near the edge of Nez Perce National Forest. I wasn't deep into the mountains, just far enough that I couldn't see the highway or any houses. The only road out there was a loose dirt one that twisted through the trees. My cell signal was weak, but I had a GPS, a satellite emergency beacon, and enough food and water for 2 weeks. I brought a rifle too, just in case something came too close. I had no intention of using it, but it felt stupid not to bring one. I spent the first few days just hiking around. The forest was thick and quiet, filled with lodgepole pine, fir, and tamarack. The air was clean and dry. In the evenings, I'd make a small fire, cook simple meals, and write in a notebook I brought. It was peaceful, exactly what I wanted. On the 4th day, I found the trail. It wasn't a marked trail. There were no signs or trailheads, but you could tell people had walked through there before. The brush was parted, and the ground was beaten down in a long, narrow stretch that curved away through the trees. It didn't look fresh, but it wasn't overgrown either. I was a couple of miles from my camper at that point, hiking without a destination. I didn't think much of it. I figured maybe hunters had made the path, or animals had been using it. I followed it. The trail cut northeast, weaving through tall trees and past big boulders that looked like they'd rolled down from the hills decades ago. It was cooler under the trees, and the wind didn't carry much sound. I walked for about 40 minutes, stopping now and then to look at the moss on the rocks or drink water. I wasn't worried. I had my GPS and I knew how to get back. Then the trees opened up, and I saw the cabin. It was old, very old. The roof sagged in the middle, and the wood was weathered gray and cracked in places. The porch had a half-collapsed railing, and the steps leading up to it were warped and leaning sideways. One window was broken, and the glass on the others was covered in so much dirt I couldn't see through it. There was no road leading up to it, no signs of recent life, just trees, shrubs, and a wide clearing of dead grass and packed dirt. I stopped a good 30 feet away. Something about it made me uneasy right away, not scared, just unsettled. It looked forgotten, like it hadn't been touched in decades, and that gave it a weird kind of weight in the middle of that quiet forest. I stared at it for a long time. I should have turned around and gone back, but I didn't. Instead, I stepped forward. The closer I got, the more detail I could see. The rusted nails sticking out of the boards, the dried brown stain on one of the porch steps, the way the door hung slightly open. My boots crunched on the gravel and dead twigs. A crow somewhere above gave a short cry and flew off, its wings flapping hard. That sound felt louder than it should have in all that quiet. I walked up the steps. One of them groaned and dipped, nearly giving out under my weight. I looked at the door. There was no knob, just a jagged hole where one had once been. I reached out, pushed it open. Inside, it was even darker than I expected. The cabin had one room, maybe two if there was a separate area off the back that I couldn't see. The main space had a stone fireplace, an old metal bed frame with torn fabric, and a small wooden table that was half rotted. Everything was covered in dust. The floor creaked loudly when I stepped in. I didn't go far, just a few steps past the doorway. The air inside smelled like rot and dust and something else, like old animal hair. I turned in a slow circle, looking at everything. That's when I saw the wall. It was the far wall, opposite the fireplace. The wood there was covered in scratches, some deep, some shallow, all crisscrossing each other like someone had been clawing at it for years. At first, I thought they were animal marks, but the pattern was too strange. Some of the scratches had made letters, words. They weren't full sentences, just phrases and names etched deeply into the wood. I walked over and crouched near the wall. The first thing I noticed was the name C. Dawson, 1978, scratched hard into the lower left corner. Above it, there were dozens of others: N, Clark, D, Tully, M, Reed. Some had years next to them. 1979, 1981, 1986. One just said, July 1989. Some looked like they'd been scratched with a nail or a knife. There were other words too, not names. Things like, don't stay too quiet at night. They came back, and no one heard me. It was hard to read them all, because so many scratches overlapped. But I sat there for a long time, just tracing them with my fingers, trying to figure out who these people were, why they came here, why they wrote on the wall, why they left, or if they did. I felt cold, not scared exactly, but tight, like the air was thinner in there. I stood up and backed away from the wall. Something shifted in the far corner of the cabin. A sound soft like dirt falling. I froze. I turned slowly. There was nothing there. Just a mound of debris, sticks, pine needles, old rags. Probably a rat's nest or something. But I didn't like it. I didn't like any of it. I backed toward the door, keeping my eyes on that dark corner. Then I stepped outside. I stayed on the porch for a few minutes, trying to settle myself. I told myself it was just an old cabin, just old writings on a wall. Nothing happened. Nobody was there. But I couldn't stop thinking about that sound. I walked back to camp faster than I'd hiked out. I didn't run, but I didn't stop either. The trail felt narrower than before. The trees were closer. The wind didn't blow anymore. When I reached the camper, I went inside, locked the door, and sat with the rifle across my knees for an hour without moving. That night, I didn't sleep well. Every sound outside made me sit up straight. Branches cracking, owls calling, something rustling through the leaves. I told myself it was just wildlife, normal stuff, but it didn't feel normal. The next morning, I packed up early. I told myself I wasn't scared. I just didn't feel right there anymore. I needed a change of scenery, maybe head further south, closer to the Salmon River. But I didn't leave right away. I kept thinking about the names on the wall. I took my phone and opened the photos I'd taken. One by one, I looked at the names again. Then I opened my GPS and marked the spot where the cabin was, just in case. Back in town a week later, I stopped at a small library. I told the woman working there I was researching old cabins in the area, and she pointed me to a couple of binders full of Forest Service records and handwritten maps from the 60s and 70s. I sat at the table for hours flipping through them. I didn't find anything labeled as a cabin at the exact spot, but I did find something else. There was a paragraph in an old ranger's report from August 1986, handwritten and scanned into the binder. It mentioned illegal squatters living in unknown structure northeast of Miller's Pass. The ranger said he found signs of a camp, but no people. Just a handmade lean-to, some empty cans, and carved names on a tree. He wrote, "Unclear how long they were here. Signs of multiple individuals over the last decade. Several names carved into timber, possibly kids or runaways. Referred to something called the wall. Left site undisturbed due to structural hazard." That was it. That was all it said. I went home after that. I flew back to Chicago and started looking for new work. I tried to forget about the cabin. I deleted the GPS marker after a few months, but I never deleted the photos. Sometimes late at night, I still look at them. The scratches, the words, the names. Sometimes I wonder who C. Dawson was, if he ever made it back out, if any of them did. And sometimes, when it's very quiet, I think about the cabin still sitting there in the woods, slowly falling apart. The wind moving through the trees, the sound of something shifting in the dark. And I wonder if anyone else found it after me. I hope they didn't go inside. It was in late October 2017 when I decided I needed a break. I just turned 33, and things in London had been piling up. Work stress, a breakup, bills, the usual stuff. I hadn't taken time off in months. I didn't want to fly anywhere or go somewhere expensive. I just wanted to go off the grid for a few days. Be alone. No emails, no calls, just trees, fresh air, and silence. I found a small cabin for rent online. It was in the woods near Kielder Forest in Northumberland, close to the Scottish border. The listing said it was built by the owner's grandfather back in the 70s, completely off-grid, no Wi-Fi, no cell signal, just a wood burner, solar-powered lights, and a few gas appliances. The pictures looked perfect. One main room, a wood frame bed, a tiny kitchenette, and big windows facing the forest. It looked peaceful, isolated, simple. Exactly what I wanted. I booked it for 4 nights, from a Thursday to a Monday. I planned to bring some books, basic food, a cooler, and just relax. No people.
No noise.
Just me and the woods. The drive up from London was long. I left at dawn and arrived near dusk. After turning off the A68, I followed a series of narrow, winding country roads through farmland and forest. Then finally, I reached a gravel path with a small wooden sign that read Westridge Cabin. The road was more like a track, bumpy and full of potholes. I followed it slowly for about 2 miles through thick trees until it opened up to a small clearing. The cabin was there, surrounded by pines and mossy rocks. A little wooden porch, a stack of logs by the door, and a metal chimney pipe sticking out of the roof. I parked beside it, turned off the engine, and just listened. Nothing, not even a breeze. No traffic, no people, no airplanes, just deep, perfect silence. Inside the cabin was small but warm. One room like I expected. There was a double bed in the corner, a small table by the window, a chair, some shelves with candles, books, and matches. There was a propane stove, a kettle, and a jug for water that I'd need to fill from the rain barrel outside. A compost toilet in a wooden shed about 20 feet away. Everything smelled of wood, slightly damp but clean. That first night I lit the fire, cooked some pasta, and read until I fell asleep. I didn't see or hear anything unusual. The next morning I woke up early, just after 7. The forest outside was covered in mist. Everything looked still and gray, and a little eerie in a beautiful way. I made coffee and sat on the porch with a jacket on, listening to the birds wake up. Around midday, I took a long walk along one of the footpaths that led away from the cabin. I brought a compass and a paper map that the owner had left behind, just to be safe. The forest was huge. Dense pine woods with muddy trails and fallen logs, moss growing on everything. I walked for nearly 3 hours before looping back. It wasn't until that second night that I started feeling a bit off. I had just finished eating and was cleaning the small pan in a bucket outside when I noticed something odd. There were footprints in the dirt near the side of the cabin. Not mine. They were older, maybe from earlier in the day, but I hadn't been around that side since I arrived. They looked like boot prints, narrow and small. Not a man's, I thought. Possibly a woman's. At first, I didn't think much of it. Maybe the owner had been there earlier that morning. Or maybe they were from the last guest and had just held their shape because of the soft dirt. I pushed it out of my mind. That night, I heard something around 2 in the morning. It sounded like soft footsteps in the leaves. Very faint, maybe 20 feet from the cabin. I sat up in bed and held my breath. I thought it could have been a deer or a fox, maybe a badger. I didn't have a torch right beside me, but there was a small lantern near the table. I didn't want to move or make a sound. After about 30 seconds, the sound stopped. Just a couple of slow steps, then silence again. In the morning, I checked around the clearing. I didn't see anything obvious. No animals, no fresh prints, nothing moved or disturbed. But I still couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been walking out there. That day, I stayed close to the cabin. I read, made tea, split some logs, and tried to relax. Around 5 p.m., I took a short walk up the ridge behind the cabin. From there, you could see down through the trees toward a slope on the other side. And that's when I saw her for the first time. It was just a glimpse, a flash of movement between the trees. About 100 yards down the hill, near a narrow gully. A figure standing still. I stopped walking and squinted. The trees were thick, the light was going. But I saw what looked like a woman. Tall, thin, wearing a dark coat. Long gray hair. She was just standing there, almost behind a tree, but not hiding fully. Facing me. I didn't move for a while. She didn't either. Then I blinked or shifted my head slightly. And when I looked again, she was gone. I walked back to the cabin a little faster than usual. I told myself it was a local hiker, someone walking a trail I hadn't seen on the map. But who hikes this deep in the woods in late October, alone, and doesn't say a word? That night, I locked the door, even though the listing said it was safe country. I kept the fire low so it wouldn't light up the windows too much. I didn't sleep well. Every small sound outside made me freeze. The next morning, I went down to the area where I had seen the woman. I followed the slope down through wet leaves and brush. There were no obvious trails or paths.
No campsites.
No huts or markers. But about 10 minutes into the woods, I found something that gave me a chill. It was a tree, an old one with some string tied around it, like twine or kitchen string. Bits of cloth were stuck in the knots, old, dirty fabric. It looked like someone had been using it to hang something or tie things down. Beneath the tree, the ground was disturbed, like someone had been digging or clearing the area. It didn't look like an animal den. There were cigarette butts pushed into the bark of a nearby tree. Fresh ones. Someone had been here recently. I walked back fast. I felt like I was being watched. That afternoon, I heard something on the roof. It sounded like a branch or stick sliding, then a soft thump. I went out and looked around but saw nothing. There were no branches above the cabin. The nearest tall tree was at least 20 feet away. I looked up and scanned the ridge. Nothing, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been close, maybe even watching from the woods. That night, I barely slept. I stayed up most of it, holding a hatchet that was meant for chopping wood. At one point, maybe around 3 a.m., I thought I saw movement outside the front window. Just a shape. I froze. Didn't move. Didn't breathe. But after a few seconds, it was gone. I didn't go outside. By the fourth day, I was done. I didn't want to stay the last night. I packed everything quickly that morning, trying to be quiet even though I was alone. When I opened the door to bring out my bag, I noticed something on the porch that hadn't been there before. A small item like a token or charm. It was made of sticks tied together with the same kind of string I'd seen on the tree. A bundle shaped like a person. A tiny human form with arms and legs. No face, just bound sticks. It hadn't been there the night before. I didn't touch it. I just left it and threw my stuff in the car. As I drove back down the track, I glanced in the rearview mirror. For a second, on the edge of the clearing, I saw her again. The same woman. Thin, gray-haired, standing still at the tree line. No movement, no sound. Just watching. I didn't stop. I didn't report anything. What would I say? A creepy woman looked at me and left a stick doll on the porch? There was no law broken, no threat. Just something off. Something that made my skin crawl. Back in London, I tried to forget about it. But a few weeks later, I looked up that cabin listing again out of curiosity. It was gone. I searched the name of the cabin, Westridge Cabin, Northumberland, and found a local forum post from 2015, before my trip. A woman had been walking her dog in that forest, near Kielder, and mentioned seeing an old lady living in the woods, who didn't speak, just stared. Other comments said similar things. Gray woman, thin with long hair, keeps to herself, not dangerous, just weird. Apparently, she had been living out there for years. Not in a cabin, not in a house, just out there. There were no follow-up posts, no police reports, just a bunch of stories about hikers feeling watched, campers finding strange things outside their tents, or people seeing movement in the trees. Nobody knew who she was. Some thought she was homeless. Others thought she was just a hermit who wanted to be left alone. I don't know if she meant any harm. I really don't. But I do know that someone walked up to that cabin while I was asleep and left something made by hand. Someone watched me more than once. And someone walked those woods without ever being heard, just seen barely. I haven't been back to Northumberland since. And I never will. I was 31 when I took a solo trip to a cabin near the Utah-Arizona border in late October of 2019. I had just quit my job in Denver. Not because I hated it, but because I was burned out and my boss kept piling on more responsibilities without giving me a raise. I'd saved enough to give myself a little time to breathe. So I decided to disappear for a few weeks. Not on a beach, not in Europe. Just off-grid. Somewhere cold, quiet, and far from people. I found a listing online for a privately owned cabin located a little west of Big Water, Utah. Middle of nowhere. One road in, one road out. The pictures showed a rough, single-story wooden structure surrounded by dry scrubland, flat and endless in every direction, with some red cliffs far off to the east. No neighbors for miles. It had no internet, no cell service, and no fancy amenities. Just a wood stove, a cot, a solar panel that charged a battery for light, and a big metal tank for water. It was exactly what I wanted. I arrived the second week of October, just as the days were getting shorter. It was still warm in the daytime, but cold at night, sometimes just above freezing. The cabin sat on a patch of pale desert land, surrounded by junipers and hard-packed dirt. There was a narrow 2-track trail that led from the main road for about 6 miles through uneven terrain. The rental guy emailed me a PDF with instructions like how to reset the solar charger, where to refill the water tank if I needed to, and even how to shoot a snake if one got into the cabin. He didn't mention anything weird, just dry, practical stuff. I brought a Glock 19 just in case. I wasn't trying to be paranoid, but out there, you didn't have neighbors to call for help. The first few days were peaceful. I filled a notebook with thoughts, read old books I'd packed, went on hikes, and cooked simple food on a propane burner. I didn't see another human being the entire time. A few animal tracks around the cabin, but nothing serious. It was what I needed. I didn't even care that I couldn't reach anyone by phone. In fact, it felt like a relief. I was alone in the truest sense. But that changed around the 5th night. That night was colder than the others. I remember waking up shivering even though I had the fire going in the stove. I threw on a jacket and stepped outside to pee. The moon was maybe a sliver above the cliffs, barely lighting the brush. The wind had that dry, sharp edge to it, like it was cutting through every gap in the wood siding. I remember how quiet it was. Not peaceful quiet. Unnatural quiet. No crickets. No coyotes howling. No wind in the grass. When I turned to go back inside, I noticed something odd. Off to the edge of the treeline, maybe 30 yards from the cabin, there was a figure. Not walking, just standing. It wasn't moving. I thought maybe it was a deer or an elk at first, but the shape was wrong. Too upright, too still. I froze with my hand on the doorknob. I couldn't see details, just a silhouette. I blinked a few times, trying to make sense of it, and it was gone. Just gone. No footsteps, no rustling in the brush. It hadn't run. It hadn't walked. It just wasn't there anymore. I stood still for probably another full minute before stepping backward into the cabin and locking the door behind me. I figured maybe I imagined it. Or maybe it had been a bush shaped like a person in the dark. I went to bed gripping my pistol under the blanket, listening for sounds. Nothing came. The next morning, I walked over to where I thought the figure had been. The ground was mostly dry and hard-packed, but I did find something odd. A single long drag mark, like something had been pulled or something had scraped through the dirt. Not like a tire track, more like someone had dragged a branch or a piece of cloth. No footprints, though. It just trailed off into the brush and stopped. I started to get that uncomfortable feeling in my chest, like when you're being watched but you can't see who's doing it. I shook it off, went back to the cabin, and made myself some eggs. Still told myself it was probably nothing. But that day, the wind picked up. A weird wind, like it carried voices in it. Not actual words, but the rise and fall of tone, like someone whispering far off in the canyon. I didn't see anyone that day. I stayed close to the cabin and kept checking the horizon. Every time I thought I saw movement, it would vanish before I could really focus on it. That night, I made sure all the shutters were closed and latched. I kept the fire low, barely glowing. I didn't sleep much. I kept hearing noises. Footsteps, I thought, on the dirt outside. They'd crunch once, twice, then nothing. Then again from another direction. I got up 3 times and looked out the peephole in the door. Nothing. Once I thought I saw a hand brush past the window. Thin, long and pale. But again, I could have been imagining it. The next morning, I found something that made my stomach turn. Near the water barrel at the side of the cabin, there were prints in the dirt. bare human feet. No shoes. Too big for a woman, too narrow and long for a man. Just wrong. They came right up to the barrel and vanished. Not turned around. Not faded away. Just gone. I decided to hike out to the small bluff about a mile away where I could get some height and maybe a bit of cell signal. I took my pistol and a small backpack. Up there, I had about 2 bars, just enough to send a quick text to my brother in Idaho saying I was fine but would be heading home early. I didn't tell him anything else. I started back down just as the sun was dipping, trying to beat the dark. On the trail back, I heard something behind me. First twigs snapping, then the sound of breathing. Heavy, not panting, just breathing. I turned and saw nothing, but the sound would start again as soon as I began walking. I stopped again. Nothing. I sped up. Then I heard it running, just for a second, then silence again. I broke into a full run for the last half mile. My legs were burning. I didn't stop until I slammed the cabin door shut behind me and locked it. I stayed awake that night with the gun in my lap, sitting by the door, ears tuned to every sound outside. At one point, something knocked on the back wall. Just one knock. Solid. Loud. Then nothing. The next day, I packed up. I didn't care if I lost the last few days I'd paid for. I wanted out. But when I got to my truck, I found something that made me feel sick. There were scratches, thin and deep, along the driver's side door. Not animal scratches. These were lines, almost like someone had used a long, sharp nail to write something. There weren't words, just symbols. Jagged, looping shapes like someone trying to write who didn't know how. My front left tire was flat. Not just flat. **/**. I didn't panic. I just started working, got the spare on, got the bags in. And just before I left, I noticed something by the edge of the clearing where the tree line started. Person, or something shaped like a person. It was crouched, low to the ground, almost like it was pretending to be an animal, completely still, watching me. I stared at it for maybe 10 seconds. Then it moved, not stood up, ***, moved ***. Fast, twitchy, like a puppet being yanked by strings. It ducked into the brush and vanished. I drove out of there without looking back once. I got to a gas station a few hours later. There were people around. Cars, lights. I felt like I had finally returned to the world. I didn't tell anyone what I saw. What would I even say? I've told myself 1,000 times that it was just some messed up person living in the desert. Maybe someone on drugs. Maybe a squatter. Maybe some lunatic who liked to mess with campers. I've looked up stories about skinwalkers before, the Navajo myths. I don't believe in that stuff. I still don't. But something was out there, and it watched me for days. Not a ghost. Not a demon. Not a fairy tale. Just a thing. Person, probably, but a person who moved wrong, who didn't want to be seen too much, who liked knowing I couldn't stop them. I haven't been back to Utah since. I don't hike alone anymore, and every now and then, when I'm walking somewhere quiet and hear a twig snap behind me, I get that same feeling in my chest, like I'm being watched. Whatever it was didn't follow me, but sometimes I wonder if it remembers me the way I remember it. My name's Travis. I'm 31 years old, born and raised in Kansas, but I was living in Colorado back in 2018. At the time, I had just come off a tough breakup and I wasn't doing great. I needed to get away from the city, from everything, honestly. One of my old coworkers, Greg, told me about his uncle's farm in southern Nebraska. The place had been empty for a while, but the cabin on it was still standing. It wasn't modern, more like an old wooden shack with a tin roof. But Greg said I could stay there for free as long as I wanted, help myself to whatever was still in the pantry, and just get my head straight. I packed up my things in a beat-up Chevy Silverado, filled a cooler with some groceries, grabbed a few books, and left town the next morning. It was a 5-hour drive, mostly flat land and grain fields. I took side roads for most of it, passing quiet towns that barely had streetlights. I didn't see a single car on the last 40 minutes of the trip. The farm was off a dirt road with no sign. I only knew I was close because of the GPS. Even that gave up right before the last turn. I found a rusted gate with a bent metal sign that read Hollinger Farm in faded white paint. That was it.
No mailbox, no fence.
Just miles of dry grass, a tree line in the distance, and a gravel path that looked like it hadn't been driven on in years. I drove up the long path, my truck bouncing and rattling on the stones. I passed 2 old barns, both falling apart with broken beams and holes in the roof. One looked like it had been scorched by fire years ago. The main farmhouse was nothing but a collapsed mess of bricks and blackened wood. I slowed down as I passed it, my tires crunching over dried leaves and sticks. The cabin was farther back, tucked between 2 rows of bare trees. It was small, maybe 20 feet wide and 30 feet long, with a sagging porch and steps that tilted to one side. There were weeds and branches piled up on the sides, and one window had a big crack running through it. But it looked livable. There was a metal chimney poking out the top, and the roof was still intact. It wasn't perfect, but it was what I needed: quiet, empty, and far from anyone. I got out of the truck, stretched my legs, and walked up the porch. The front door was warped, but it opened with a strong shove. Inside, it was dark and smelled like dust, mold, and old pine wood. There was a small kitchen to the left with yellowed counters, a chipped sink, and an old stove that probably hadn't worked in years. A wooden table sat under the only window. To the right was a cot with a stained mattress, a rocking chair, and a small shelf with books and glass jars. A trapdoor was in the corner of the floor, with a rusted handle and a pair of worn-out boots sitting on top of it. I lit a lantern I brought with me and walked around, checking for rodents or wasp nests. I found nothing at first, just spiderwebs in every corner and some mouse droppings under the table. The walls were thin, and I could hear the wind whistling through cracks in the boards. It was rough, but I told myself it was only for a few weeks. I needed the peace. The first night was uneventful. I read a few chapters of a book, ate some beef jerky and crackers, and fell asleep early. The wind picked up around midnight, and branches tapped the roof and windows, but I didn't think much of it. I was used to country sounds. It was the quiet that I noticed the most.
No engines, no voices, no lights.
Just me, the wind, and creaking wood. Things started to feel strange by the 3rd day. It began with small things. I found one of the books I left on the table sitting on the floor the next morning. I figured I knocked it over in my sleep. Then the next day, I noticed the trapdoor was cracked open a few inches. I hadn't touched it. The boots that had been resting on it were now standing upright like someone had placed them there. That same night, I woke up around 2 a.m. The wind was dead still, no sound outside, but I heard creaking beneath the floorboards. Slow, deliberate creaks like footsteps. I lay still on the cot, holding my breath. It was probably mice, I told myself, or the wood settling, but it went on for several minutes. I finally got up, grabbed my flashlight, and opened the trapdoor. The basement was just a shallow root cellar, dirt walls, some shelves with broken jars, and a rotted wooden chair in one corner. No signs of animals.
No footprints.
Nothing. I closed it and tried to forget about it. By the end of the week, I started hearing noises outside at night. Not animals, not coyotes or owls. These were heavy, slow movements. I'd hear snapping branches near the tree line, or the sound of something brushing against the side of the cabin. I never saw anything when I checked, but the feeling of being watched was constant. One morning, I stepped out and found footprints in the dirt beside the cabin. Not boots, not bare feet, just smooth, deep impressions that didn't match my own. They led from the tree line to the back of the cabin and stopped under the window. I looked around the area, but there was no one, no tire tracks, nothing. I told myself I must have left them and just forgotten, but they were too far apart and too wide. I measured them next to mine. They were longer by at least 2 inches and wider, too. I considered leaving that day, but I didn't want to feel like I was giving up. I told myself it was in my head, that the stress from the breakup, the isolation, and the silence were messing with me. I had come out here to clear my thoughts. Maybe I just needed to get out during the day, explore the land, do something other than sit inside and read. So the next morning, I walked out past the barns, through the field, and into the woods behind the property. The air was dry, and the ground was cracked in spots. I followed a faint trail that led deeper into the trees. About half a mile in, I found an old hunting blind, rusted and half collapsed. There were beer cans and shell casings around it, long faded from weather. Further down, I came across a clearing with what looked like a pile of old farm equipment. But when I got closer, I realized it wasn't just tools. There were animal bones scattered in the grass. Dozens of them, some small like rabbits or raccoons, others larger. A rusted metal drum lay tipped over, and next to it, a blackened rope hung from a branch above, swaying slightly in the breeze. I turned back quickly, heart thudding. I didn't want to jump to conclusions, but something felt wrong. The whole place felt off. That night, I heard scratching at the walls. Not from mice. These were long, dragging sounds like fingernails on wood. I sat on the edge of the bed with my hunting knife in hand, staring at the door. It stopped after maybe 10 minutes. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I found 3 long gouges carved into the wooden door. Fresh splinters still hung off the edges. Whatever did it had claws or something sharp. I was done pretending it was nothing. I packed my cooler, loaded the truck, and decided I'd leave that evening, drive through the night if I had to. Around 5 p.m., just before I was ready to leave, I went back inside to grab the lantern I'd left near the cot. The cabin was colder than usual. Quiet, too quiet. As I stepped inside, I heard the trapdoor creak behind me. I turned around slowly. It was open fully this time. I stood there for a full minute, frozen. I didn't want to go near it, but I also didn't want to leave it open. I stepped toward it with the knife in one hand and my flashlight in the other. I shined the light down. There was someone at the bottom of the cellar stairs. He was crouched, half hidden by the dirt wall. A man, thin and filthy, with torn clothes and long, matted hair. His face was streaked with dirt and something darker. He didn't move when the light hit him, just stared up at me. I slammed the trapdoor shut and dragged the table over it. My hands shook as I backed away. I grabbed my bag and bolted out the door. I didn't look back. I ran to the truck, jumped in, and tore down the gravel path without stopping. I didn't care if I wrecked my suspension on the rocks. I just wanted out. I drove until I reached the next town, an hour away, and parked in a gas station lot. I sat there until sunrise. Later that week, I called Greg and told him everything. He was quiet for a long time, then said his uncle used to let drifters stay in the barns during winter. Some stayed longer than they were supposed to. One man in particular had gone missing years back, last seen somewhere near the property. I don't know if it was him down there. I don't know how long he'd been living under that cabin or how many nights he was just inches beneath me. All I know is it wasn't ghosts or monsters. It was a real person, a man who had been watching me, a man who'd been waiting. I never went back to that farm. I sold the truck a year later, moved to a new city, and tried to forget it all. But I still wake up some nights thinking about the sound of those footsteps beneath the floor, the trapdoor creaking open, and that face staring up at me from the dark. And I keep thinking, what if I hadn't checked? What if I had stayed one more night? It was the fall of 2016 when I decided to get away from everything for a bit. I had been living in Pittsburgh for a few years, working in construction and doing long hours on big concrete jobs. That year had worn me out bad. I didn't want to talk to anyone, didn't want to go to bars or watch TV. I just wanted to be alone for a few days, somewhere quiet, somewhere out in the woods. I remembered this little cabin I had rented once years ago with a friend in upstate New York, near the edge of Adirondack Park. It was cheap, very basic, no Wi-Fi, no cell service, and just one road in and out. The owner lived in a town about 45 minutes away and only came by to check on the place once a month or so. I called him and he still had the cabin. It wasn't booked. I took it for 5 days and told him I'd leave the key in the mailbox like before. I packed my truck with the usual stuff: cooler with food, water jugs, a sleeping bag, flashlight, propane stove, batteries, a hatchet, and a small pistol I kept for safety. I wasn't expecting trouble, but being alone in the woods, especially in a place without service, always made me a little careful. I drove up on a Tuesday morning and got to the place around 3 p.m. The road to the cabin was worse than I remembered. It wasn't paved, just a narrow gravel path cutting through thick trees. The leaves had started to fall, and some parts of the road were slick with wet mud and dead branches. I had to slow down more than once to avoid getting stuck. When I finally pulled up to the cabin, I felt that strange stillness you only get deep in the woods. No wind, no cars, not even birds at that moment. Just trees and cold, damp air. The cabin was small, made of dark wood, and looked like it hadn't been cleaned in a long time. The windows were streaked with dirt, and the porch creaked when I stepped onto it. But I didn't care. I was there to be alone, not comfortable. I unpacked quickly, set up my food in the small pantry, put my sleeping bag on the bed, and made sure the flashlight worked. The place had no electricity, just a couple of oil lanterns and a wood stove. I started a small fire in the stove right away to warm it up. The first night passed quietly. I made some soup on the propane stove and read an old paperback I'd brought with me. Around midnight, I turned in. The bed was hard, but I slept fine. No sounds, no animals, nothing weird. The second day, I spent walking a few of the old trails behind the cabin. I found one that looped through the woods and crossed a small stream. The forest was thick in that area, and I didn't see anyone. I didn't even see signs of people. No footprints, no wrappers, nothing. That's what I liked about it. But late that afternoon, something changed. I was sitting on the porch drinking a cup of instant coffee when I noticed a figure walking down the road, maybe 200 yards away. He was far, just a shadow through the trees. I couldn't see his face. He wore a brown jacket, dark pants, and had something slung over his shoulder. Looked like a rifle. Now, I knew it was hunting season, but still, something about him set off a little alarm in my head. He wasn't dressed like the hunters I usually saw. No orange vest, no gear, no dog. He was just walking slow, not like someone out tracking game, more like someone heading somewhere with no hurry. And he didn't glance around or look up. He just kept walking until he disappeared around a bend in the road. I watched the trees for a while after he was gone. I tried to tell myself it was nothing. A local guy, maybe heading to another cabin or just scouting the woods. But I couldn't shake the feeling that he didn't belong there. Something about his body language was off, too calm, too casual. That night, I kept the lantern on longer than usual. I checked the lock on the door twice before going to bed and left the pistol loaded and within reach. I didn't sleep much. The third day was colder. Gray sky, no sun, and the wind had picked up. I stayed near the cabin, cutting small pieces of wood with the hatchet and stacking them by the door. Around noon, I hiked back to the stream with my thermos. On the way, I found fresh boot prints. Not mine. They were newer, not filled in by fallen leaves like mine were. They weren't deep, so the guy wasn't heavy, and they were going the opposite direction I'd come from. I crouched by them and followed them for about 40 feet before they veered off the trail into the trees. I stood there for a while, listening, but I didn't hear anything. No snapping branches, no birds, nothing. When I got back to the cabin, I was more alert than before. I kept scanning the tree line. I tried not to panic, but I had that strange gut feeling again, that crawling sense in the back of your neck like you're being watched. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I lay in the bed fully clothed, with my boots on, just staring at the ceiling in the dim orange glow from the lantern. Every sound outside felt louder than it should have been. The wind pushed against the windows, and the trees groaned against each other. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps on the gravel outside, but when I peeked out the curtain, I didn't see anything. By morning, I felt exhausted. My body was tight with stress, and I kept glancing toward the woods. I wanted to leave, but part of me didn't want to act paranoid. I told myself I'd stay one more night and leave early in the morning. Around noon, I saw him again. He was standing just inside the tree line across the road. Not walking this time, standing still, barely visible between the trees. I only noticed him because the shape of his jacket didn't match the trees behind it. He didn't move. I stared for maybe a full minute, waiting for him to turn or step out, but he didn't. He just stood there, like he was watching. I slowly stepped back inside and shut the door, locking it. I turned off the lantern, moved the chair away from the window, and sat on the floor with my back to the wall, pistol in my hand. I sat like that for nearly an hour, trying to listen, trying to calm myself down. When I finally got the nerve to peek out the window again, he was gone. That night, I didn't light the stove. I didn't cook. I just lay in bed in silence, no light, no fire. I watched the window barely blinking. I kept hearing things, soft snaps, maybe branches, maybe not. At some point past midnight, I heard the sound of gravel shifting. A single step, then another, then silence. The steps were right outside the cabin. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I waited, pistol in my hand, finger ready. Then I heard it, the doorknob turning. He tried it once, slow, then again. It was locked. He didn't knock, didn't speak, just tried it again. Then I heard the soft crunch of boots stepping off the porch. A few more footsteps into the gravel. Then silence again. I sat like that until the sun started to rise. I never slept. As soon as it was light enough to see, I packed everything in a hurry, left the firewood, didn't bother with trash, didn't care about the dishes. I got in my truck and started the engine. But I didn't drive out right away. I checked the side of the cabin first. There, in the dirt beside the porch, were the footprints. Fresh, clear. He'd stood right at the door for at least a minute, maybe longer. I followed them with my eyes. They went off into the trees again, same direction as before. I drove fast down the gravel road, bouncing over roots and rocks. Didn't care about the noise or damage. I just needed to get out. When I hit the main road, I drove all the way back to Pittsburgh in one go. Didn't stop except once for gas. I called the owner of the cabin a week later. I didn't tell him everything, just said there might have been someone poking around out there, maybe a poacher. He said he'd check on it, but I didn't ask if he ever found anything. I didn't want to know. I never went back. That trip was supposed to help me clear my head, get some peace. But instead, it left me with something I can't shake. It wasn't a ghost, wasn't a monster. It was just a man. A quiet, patient man with a rifle and a reason to be out there. One that I still don't understand. But whatever his reason was, I was in his woods, and I was lucky to get out when I did. My name is Derek Sloan. I was 33 when this happened, and it was the winter of 2016. I had just come out of a messy breakup and wanted to get away from everything for a while. I'd always been into hunting, and I knew of this old hunting cabin up in the northern part of Minnesota, not far from the Canadian border. My dad and I used to go there every winter when I was younger, so it had a sort of nostalgic pull to it. I figured some time alone in the woods with nothing but my rifle and the cold air would clear my head. The cabin belonged to a friend of my dad's, a guy named Carl who passed away years ago. Nobody really went up there anymore, but the structure was still standing. I had the keys from way back and knew the place would be empty. It was isolated, deep in the woods, down an old logging road that barely existed anymore. No cell service, no power, no neighbors. Just an old propane stove, a fireplace, and a couple of rusted cots inside. The kind of place that hadn't been touched in years except by snow and squirrels. I left Duluth early one morning in December and drove my pickup north for about 5 hours. The last hour was slow and rough, with thick snow covering the ground and only tire tracks from God knows how long ago. I had snow chains on and four-wheel drive, so I made it through. By the time I reached the turnoff for the logging road, it was almost 4 p.m. The sun was already dipping low. I drove another few miles into the forest, then parked in a small clearing near the cabin. The cabin looked about the same as I remembered, maybe a little more weathered. The front door creaked on its hinges, and when I stepped inside, the cold air slapped me in the face. Everything smelled like pine, dust, and old wood. I could see my breath in front of me. I set my gear down, including a week's worth of food, some propane for the stove, and all my hunting gear. I didn't plan on staying the full week, but I packed like I might. The first night was quiet. I fired up the old propane heater and threw some wood in the fireplace. I had to chop most of it outside, and my fingers were numb by the time I got the fire going. I set up my cot near the fire, made some canned chili, and ate it with a plastic spoon. I hadn't seen a single person since I left the highway. No headlights, no distant barking dogs, no chimneys puffing smoke. Just me and the trees. The next morning I woke up early, around 5 a.m. The cold had crept into my bones during the night, and the fire had gone out. I got it going again, made some instant coffee, and put on my thickest gear. I strapped on my rifle and headed out. The forest was completely silent. No birds, no wind, just the crunch of my boots in the snow. I headed east of the cabin, following a small ridge that overlooked a frozen creek. It was the same trail my dad and I always took. I saw a few fresh tracks, maybe a deer or two, but nothing else. The snow was light and powdery. I stood still for nearly an hour in one spot, just listening. There's something peaceful about being alone in the woods like that, but it's also strange. You start hearing things, cracks in the trees, a gust of wind that sounds like footsteps, distant snapping that could be a branch or something else. I didn't see anything that day. I headed back to the cabin around 3 p.m. just as it was starting to get dark again. The sun sets fast up there in winter. I made a fire, cooked some soup, and sat in the old wooden chair by the window. That's when I saw something that caught me off guard. Footprints. In the snow. They weren't mine. They came from the edge of the tree line, about 30 yards out, and stopped a few feet from the cabin's side window. Then they turned around and went back the way they came. I stared at them for a long time. They weren't deep, which meant they were fresh, probably made within the last couple of hours. No sign of animal tracks around them, just boots, normal-sized, maybe a man's. I walked out with my flashlight and followed them with my rifle slung tight. The tracks led straight into the trees and then disappeared into deeper snow. I stood there scanning the forest, listening, but nothing moved. I called out once instinctively, but quickly regretted it. My voice sounded too loud, too exposed. I headed back to the cabin, locked the door, and double-checked the windows. There were shutters on a couple of them, so I closed those. I didn't sleep much that night. I sat up most of the time, rifle across my lap, staring at the flames. I kept listening for any movement outside. Nothing. The next morning, I found the footprints again. This time, they were back. Same boots, same pattern. They stopped by the window again, then turned and went into the woods. But this time, the snow was deeper, and I could follow them a little farther. They led me about half a mile east, over the creek, and toward a thicket of pine trees. That's when I noticed something strange. Bits of cloth on a branch, blue flannel, and then, down in a small ditch, I saw a pile of snow that looked unnatural. I walked down and poked at it with my boot. Underneath was a torn-up sleeping bag, an old thermos, and a crushed pack of cigarettes. Someone had camped there. Recently, I didn't find a person, but I found enough to know someone had been nearby, maybe watching the cabin, maybe trying to avoid being seen. I headed back and sat inside for a long time, just trying to figure it out. The logical part of my brain said it was probably just a hunter like me, maybe someone squatting or living off-grid. But the way they came close to the window, just standing there, it didn't feel right. By the fourth day, I was on edge. I barely slept. I kept thinking I heard footsteps in the snow, but when I looked out the window, there was nothing. Around noon, I went out to check the trees again, thinking I'd try to scare off whoever it was. I walked the full loop out past the thicket, the ditch, and even circled around the back end of the cabin. That's when I found something that made my stomach drop. A piece of paper stuck in the tree with a knife. A hunting knife deep into the bark. The paper had just 2 words, scribbled in black ink. Go home. That was it. I yanked the knife out and folded the paper into my pocket. I didn't know what else to do. The snow around the area was disturbed. Footprints, signs of movement. Whoever it was, they had been close. Real close. Maybe watching me while I walked past. Maybe circling around me as I stared into the woods. I rushed back to the cabin, packed everything I could, and started loading it into the truck. But when I got behind the wheel and turned the key, nothing happened. Dead. Battery was gone. I sat there gripping the wheel, staring at the frost on the windshield. I had checked the truck that morning. It had started just fine. But now, nothing. Not even a click. The hood was shut tight. No signs of damage. But the battery was drained cold. I went back inside and made a decision. I'd leave on foot the next morning and head west toward a ranger station I remembered seeing about 10 miles out. I had a map. I could make it even through snow. That night, I barely moved. I didn't sleep. Every creak of the cabin made me tense. I didn't bother with the fire. I didn't want to signal my location. I kept the rifle close, and I sat with my back against the door. Around 3 a.m., I heard it. Crunching snow. Not far, maybe 20 feet outside. Then a hand brushing the side wall of the cabin. A slow dragging sound. Then silence. I waited. 30 minutes later, I stepped out with my flashlight and swept the area. Footprints. 1 pair. Same boots. This time they didn't stop by the window. They circled the cabin, all the way around, then disappeared into the woods. I didn't wait until morning. I grabbed my pack, threw it over my shoulder, and left on foot, rifle in hand. I didn't look back. I hiked for hours through waist-deep snow, my legs burning, my face numb. I kept hearing branches cracking behind me, like someone walking just far enough back to stay out of sight. I didn't stop. I didn't rest. Around noon, I finally saw the ranger station, just a small wooden building with a green roof near the edge of a frozen lake. I pounded on the door until someone answered. I didn't tell them the full story, just said my truck died and I had to hike out. They drove me back in a snowmobile, helped me tow the truck, and I left everything else behind. I never went back for it. To this day, I don't know who was out there. Maybe someone living rough, maybe someone dangerous, maybe someone who just didn't want me there. But I learned something that week. Solitude feels different when you realize you're not actually alone. I sold my rifle a month later and haven't hunted since. It was September of 2016 when I decided to take a short break from work. I was 31 at the time, living in Oklahoma City, and I had just quit a job I hated. The last few years had been a cycle of burnout and starting over. My mind was fried, and I wanted somewhere quiet to reset. I didn't want to go too far, didn't want to stay in a motel either. I remembered a place my uncle used to mention, an old cabin he had helped build back in the 80s with some friends, near a forgotten cemetery somewhere in the Ozark foothills of Arkansas. He used to joke about it when I was a kid, calling it the cabin behind the dead. I thought he was just trying to scare me, but before he died, he told me it was real. Said it had no running water, barely any electricity, but it still stood. He said if I ever wanted to disappear for a while, that'd be the place. And I guess that always stuck in the back of my mind. So after some digging through his old things, I found a crumpled up map he drew himself with a faded red X over the spot. It looked like it was a few miles off a trail that wasn't even on modern GPS. That just made me want to go more. I packed light, just a few days worth of food, a big jug of water, a headlamp, a tarp in case the roof leaked, a camp stove, and my .38 snub-nose revolver. Not because I expected trouble, but because I knew how isolated places like that could be. I had a sleeping bag, extra batteries, and my phone just for emergencies, though I figured there'd be no signal out there. The drive took most of the day. I got to the trailhead around 4 in the afternoon, parked behind a barbed wire gate, and locked everything I could. I threw on my pack and started hiking. The trail was mostly overgrown, barely visible, but the map helped. It was about 3 miles of walking uphill through dense woods, the kind where you don't hear much except the wind pushing through the leaves. I remember sweating like crazy by the time I got there. I didn't notice the cemetery until I was standing almost inside it. It was small, maybe 20 or 30 graves, some with headstones so weathered you couldn't read them anymore. Most of them were crooked, tilted in different directions. Rusty iron fencing ran along the far edge, but most of it was bent or broken. There was one large tree in the middle of it, an old oak, huge, with thick limbs that reached out like arms. The cabin was maybe 60 yards past the cemetery, tucked in a clearing behind a wall of overgrown brush. It looked exactly how I imagined it, dark, leaning slightly to the left, with moss along the roof and the corners of the windows. One of the shutters was missing, and the front steps were warped, like they'd buckle under weight. The door wasn't even locked. I stepped inside and the air smelled like dry rot and old dirt. Dust covered everything. A single cot sat in the corner with a thin, flat mattress, and a cracked wood stove sat cold near the back wall. There were no lights, no switches, just an old battery-powered lantern that didn't work when I tried it. But I liked that. I liked how still and dead the place felt. I swept the place with my flashlight and set up my sleeping bag on the cot. I unrolled it, hung the tarp across the leaky part of the ceiling I saw near the corner, and opened the one small window for a bit of fresh air. The place felt like it hadn't been used in 20 years. Maybe it hadn't. That first night was quiet. Too quiet, in fact. Even out in the woods, you usually hear things, birds, bugs, raccoons, but there was just this dead silence. The wind barely moved. I cooked a small dinner on the camp stove, read for a while under my headlamp, and went to sleep early. I woke up around 3 a.m. needing to piss. I stepped outside and did my business behind a tree. When I turned back toward the cabin, I noticed something that didn't register right away. One of the graves had been dug up, or maybe it always looked like that and I hadn't noticed. But the dirt was uneven, the kind of uneven that looks recent. The mound was sunken slightly, like it had collapsed inward. I stood there for a minute, flashlight pointed at it, trying to figure it out. But I was too tired and too cold to care at that point. I went back inside and zipped myself into the bag. The next morning, I walked over to the grave to look closer. The headstone was chipped and unreadable, and the dirt around it did look different, looser, like it had been disturbed. There was no grass growing on it either, unlike the others. I looked for footprints, claw marks, anything, but the ground was mostly just dry earth. No signs of animals. Still, I convinced myself a coyote or something must have dug into it. I didn't want to dwell on it. I spent the day hiking around, not straying too far, just exploring the woods. I found a dried-up creek bed a few hundred yards away and what looked like the remains of another cabin or maybe an old shed. Just a few logs, half buried in leaves. When I got back, I noticed something strange again. The door to the cabin was cracked open. I knew I'd closed it. Not locked, but closed. I stood there for a while, just staring at it. My heart started thumping, that weird sense that something's off, but you can't tell what. I slowly stepped inside, gun in hand, sweeping every corner. Nothing. Everything was exactly how I left it. No signs of animals, no moved items. That night, I barely slept. Every noise seemed louder. I kept the flashlight next to me and sat up several times, scanning the room, checking the window. Around midnight, I thought I heard footsteps outside. Not animal footsteps, these were heavy, like boots on dry leaves. I held my breath and listened. They stopped near the window. I didn't move, just sat there, frozen. Then nothing, just silence again. The next morning, I stepped outside and saw the ground near the window had been disturbed. Shoe prints. Real ones, not mine, different size. Whoever it was had stood under the window and walked off toward the graveyard. I followed the prints, but they disappeared after 20 feet. The earth was dry and packed in that area, so nothing showed. I circled the graves. The same one as before looked even worse. The dirt was completely sunken now, like someone had dug into it deeper. Still no grass, still no name on the stone. That was when I started to feel it, this pressure in my chest, this tightness. I didn't want to be there anymore, but I had this stupid sense of pride, like I didn't want to admit I was scared. So I stayed. One more night, I told myself. I'd leave first thing in the morning. That night, I sat with my back against the wall, gun across my lap, flashlight ready. I didn't even try to sleep. Around 2 a.m., I heard it again. Footsteps. Slow. Deliberate. They stopped right outside the door. I didn't move. I held my breath. Then the knob turned, slowly, like someone was testing it. I hadn't locked it. I never had a reason to. The door creaked open just an inch. I raised the gun and pointed it. No sound, no movement, just darkness on the other side. Then the door closed again, gently, like someone had changed their mind. I waited until morning, barely blinking. When the sun finally rose, I threw everything into my pack and got the hell out of there. I didn't stop to eat, didn't stop to check the grave, didn't even stop to piss. I hiked straight out, heart racing the whole way. When I got back to the car, it was just how I left it. I drove straight home, eyes jumping at every shadow on the highway. I never told anyone what happened. Not because I thought they wouldn't believe me, but because I still didn't know what to believe myself. A few months later, I looked up records of that area. The cemetery had no official name. A few of the names I found matched a local family from the early 1900s who died during a fever outbreak. One article mentioned a man who'd gone missing in 1984 while hiking that area. His body was never found. I don't know if it was connected, and I don't really care to know anymore. I haven't been back to the cabin. I never will. But sometimes, late at night, I'll wake up thinking I hear footsteps outside my window. Slow, deliberate, just like before. And I always check the lock. Every single night now. It was October of 2019 when I finally decided to build a small off-grid cabin out in the hills near Blue Ridge, Georgia. I was 37 at the time, recently divorced, and didn't have much tying me down anymore. I had left my job in Marietta, sold off most of what I owned, and bought a cheap plot of land. 6 acres of thick pine forest with a small creek running through the back end. It was quiet, far from the highway, and deep enough that you wouldn't just stumble onto it by accident. The land wasn't anything special, rocky in some parts, uneven in others, but it was mine. I had always wanted to build something with my hands, and this place gave me a reason to disappear for a while. Maybe permanently. I didn't have some big plan at first. I figured I'd just build a basic one-room shelter to stay in during trips out here, and I could improve it over time. By the end of September, I had already hauled in most of the supplies I needed: pressure-treated lumber, a couple tarps, nails, a handsaw, a hammer, my battery-powered drill with 3 backup batteries, and some food to last me a couple of days. The weather had been dry all week, but of course, the forecast said a strong storm system would roll in late Friday night. That gave me a small window to work. Friday morning, I loaded up my pickup and drove out there. The trail into the property was a mess. Narrow, washed out in spots, and overgrown with brush. I had to park about 200 yards from where I planned to build, but I didn't mind the walk. I was alone out there, no one around for miles, and it felt good. The spot I picked for the cabin sat in a natural clearing just beyond a row of old cedar trees. There was enough flat ground to work on, and the trees would help with the wind. I had already marked out the foundation with string and rebar stakes the week before, so I got right to work framing the floor. By noon, I had the basic flooring framed and some joists in place. I stopped to eat a can of tuna and some crackers and checked the sky. Clouds were already building to the west, darker than I liked. I didn't have any cell service out there, but I knew I had maybe 5 or 6 hours before the rain hit. I worked fast but carefully. My hands were splintered, my back sore, and sweat soaked through the back of my shirt. But I got the flooring finished and laid down 2 sheets of plywood. I set up my pop-up tent about 10 feet from the structure, tied a tarp over it in case the rain got heavy, and then got to work on the walls. I managed to frame 3 of them before the sun dipped behind the ridge. That's when the wind started to pick up. I could smell the rain before it even hit, strong, earthy, wet like moss. A few minutes later, it started to drizzle. I scrambled to pull a second tarp over the exposed wood and strapped it down tight with some cord. I didn't want everything getting soaked before I had a roof over it. I climbed into my tent around 7:30. The rain came harder now, steady, with long gusts of wind pressing against the tent walls. I laid on my sleeping pad, listening to the rain and the creaking of the trees, trying to fall asleep, but my brain wouldn't slow down. I kept thinking about the half-finished cabin out there. I kept hearing little snaps and rustles in the brush. Sometime after 10, I thought I heard something heavier than the rain. It was like a low, dragging thud. Just one. Then silence. I held my breath and listened, but there was nothing but the rain hitting the tarp. Maybe something fell. A branch, maybe. I told myself not to worry. I was tired. My mind was playing games. But then I heard it again. Another deep, dragging sound. Closer now. I sat up in the tent, pulled my flashlight from my backpack, and clicked it on. The beam cut through the mesh, lighting up the trees in front of me, but I couldn't see anything. I unzipped the flap slowly and stepped out into the rain. The ground was slick with wet leaves and pine needles. The tarp over the cabin was holding, but one corner had flapped loose in the wind. I scanned the area with the flashlight. Everything looked normal. No animals, no fallen branches, nothing out of place. But I still felt off, like something was nearby but just out of view. I walked around the cabin slowly, light swinging side to side. Behind the structure, just near the tree line, I noticed something strange in the mud tracks. Not boots, not shoes, barefoot, big, wider than mine, deep, They led from the woods right up to the edge of the structure and then back again. I froze. I hadn't seen a soul out here since I bought the land.
No hunters, no campers.
Nobody. Who the hell would be walking around out here barefoot in the rain? I didn't follow the tracks into the woods. I backed away, heart pounding, and returned to the tent. I thought about packing up and heading back to the truck, but I didn't like the idea of walking in the dark, in the rain, with something or someone out there. I decided to stay in the tent until first light. I didn't sleep. Not really. I laid there listening for hours. Rain, wind, creaks, thuds. Every now and then a faint splash from the creek. Around 2 a.m., I heard movement again. Footsteps, squishy and slow, just outside the tent. I held my breath, turned off the flashlight, and listened. The footsteps circled the tent. Then silence. My stomach twisted. I couldn't see anything through the tarp. I stayed still for nearly an hour. I didn't hear anything else. When dawn came, I stepped outside, cold and damp. The rain had stopped, but the forest was soaked and gray. The ground around the tent was a mess of mud and prints, bare feet, dozens of them, crisscrossing around the tent and the cabin frame. I followed the trail to the edge of the clearing and into the woods. The prints kept going for about 50 feet, then stopped. No sign of someone sleeping there, no campsite, no clothes, nothing. I didn't stay long. I packed up everything I could carry, covered the cabin frame again, and hiked back to my truck. I drove straight back to town. I didn't return to the property for 3 weeks. When I finally did, the cabin frame was still standing, but the tarps had been torn off. Not by wind, the ropes were cut, clean, like with a knife. One of the walls had been knocked over. Not fallen, knocked over. The supports had been yanked out, and nailed into one of the remaining studs was something I'll never forget. A dead squirrel, nailed through the head, its body rotting, a crude X carved into its belly. That was it for me. I drove back to town, went straight to the county office, and listed the land for sale. Took a loss on it. Didn't care. I didn't want it anymore. I don't know who was out there or what their reason was. Maybe some hermit lives out in those woods. Some off-grid survivalist who saw me as a threat. Maybe it was just some messed up local kids trying to scare me off. I'll never know. But I do know I wasn't wanted there. And I won't go back. I was 34 when I decided to take some time off and get away from everything. It was late September of 2022, and I had just finished a stressful renovation job down in Fort Collins, Colorado. I'd been working non-stop since April, fixing up some guy's lake house that was full of dry rot and mice nests. My body felt wrecked, and my head hadn't been clear in weeks. So I packed up my truck and drove north toward Montana. I had no real plan. I just wanted some fresh air, silence, and a few days with no phone calls. A friend of mine from college, Todd, owned a small off-grid hunting cabin about an hour west of Butte. It sat in the foothills, tucked into a patch of lodgepole pine and aspen trees, with no neighbors for miles. It was the kind of place that didn't show up on GPS. You had to drive past a rusted cattle gate, down a rutted dirt road, and hike in the last mile by foot. He hadn't used it in over a year, but said it should still be in good shape. The idea of being completely alone for a few days sounded perfect to me. I drove up the day after the fall equinox. The weather was cool and dry, and the skies were overcast. The leaves had just started to turn. It was the kind of fall air that smelled like pine needles, old bark, and distant smoke. I parked my truck at the edge of a meadow, slung on my pack, and hiked in with my dog, Red, a 6-year-old golden retriever who never left my side. The trail to the cabin was barely visible, just a vague line through the grass and trees. I followed it until I saw the clearing. The cabin was still there, right where Todd had said it would be. It was a single-room shack, maybe 12 feet by 10, built from thick logs and a rusty tin roof. The windows were fogged with grime, and the door leaned slightly off its hinges. I stepped inside. It smelled musty and cold, but everything was intact. A cot in the corner, a potbelly stove, a small wooden table, and a few plastic bins of gear. I swept out some dead bugs, laid out my sleeping bag, and cracked open a can of beans. Red curled up beside the door and dozed off instantly. I felt more relaxed than I had in months. The first day passed quietly. I spent the afternoon stacking old firewood and cutting some branches to make a better walking path around the cabin. There wasn't much to do. That was the point. I sat on the little stoop, drank coffee from my dented thermos, and listened to the wind push through the trees. Around sunset, the air dropped fast. I lit the stove and fed it some dry logs. The metal popped and ticked as it warmed, and I sat there in the orange glow until the cabin got toasty. I fell asleep early, with Red curled against my feet. The second day felt just as peaceful. I hiked up a nearby ridge to get a better view of the valley. The terrain rolled with patches of forest and dry grass. I didn't see a single structure. No barns, no houses, nothing but trees and hills. I took some pictures and headed back. On the way down, I noticed a small ravine with some fresh animal prints in the mud. Elk, maybe. I made a mental note to come back with my binoculars. That night, I stayed up a little later. The stove kept the cabin warm, and I read an old paperback Todd had left behind. Around 10, I stepped outside to pee. The sky was pitch black, and the stars were sharp and clear. I stood there for a minute, enjoying the silence. But then I heard something. It wasn't loud, just a single crack, like a branch snapping, maybe 20 yards into the trees. Red stood up straight beside me, his ears forward. I didn't see anything, but I felt a tightness in my chest. I waited a few seconds, then slowly stepped back into the cabin and latched the door. Probably just a deer, maybe a pine cone falling onto a dead limb. Nothing strange, but that feeling didn't go away. I had trouble falling asleep. Red stayed near the door all night, his head up, not fully relaxed. The next morning, I got up early and walked the perimeter. I didn't find any signs of animals or people. No tracks, no broken branches. But I couldn't shake the sense that something had changed. The air felt off, heavier somehow. The stillness was sharper. I kept looking over my shoulder as I chopped firewood. That afternoon, I hiked back up the ridge with my binoculars to look for wildlife. I saw a few distant elk grazing in the far field. No people, no vehicles. But on the way back down, I found something that stopped me cold. Near the same ravine I'd passed before, I noticed a piece of fabric stuck to a branch. Brown canvas, like the kind you'd find on a work jacket. I pulled it free and saw that it had a faint smear of something dark. Maybe sap, maybe blood. I looked around the area but didn't see anything else. The fabric wasn't mine. It wasn't from my pack or jacket. That night, I barely slept. I left the lantern burning low, and Red stayed pressed up against me. I kept hearing tiny noises outside, twigs snapping, leaves rustling, but they never lasted more than a second. When I did drift off, I dreamed of shadows moving through the trees. The fourth morning, I decided I'd leave that evening. Something about the place felt wrong now. It wasn't anything I could prove, just a constant pressure in my gut, like I was being watched. I packed my bag, left some canned food behind for the next person, and cleaned out the stove. But just before I was ready to leave, I noticed something. The plastic bin I had dragged in front of the window, the one I'd used to block drafts, had been moved. Just a little. It was subtle, but I hadn't touched it since I placed it there the first night. I looked around the cabin. Nothing else seemed out of place, but that was enough. I slung on my pack, grabbed Red's leash, and stepped out into the late afternoon light. The sky was gray, and a wind had picked up. We started the hike back to the truck, moving fast. But as we came around a bend, maybe 5 minutes from the truck, I stopped dead. There were boot prints in the mud. Fresh ones, not mine. They were coming from the opposite direction, from the woods, not the trail, and they led straight to the path I was on. They were deep, probably from a large man, and spaced wide apart like someone moving fast. Red growled low in his throat. The hair on his back stood up. I unzipped the side pocket of my pack and pulled out my hunting knife. I don't carry a gun, but I suddenly wished I did. I scanned the trees, listening. Nothing moved. The woods were quiet, too quiet. I left the trail and circled wide, making sure I wasn't being followed. It took twice as long to reach the truck, and I was sweating by the time I got there, even in the cold air. I opened the truck, threw my gear inside, and slammed the door. Red jumped in behind me, tail down, still alert. I didn't wait. I started the engine and drove straight back to the highway, eyes flicking to the rear view every few seconds. I made it back to town just after dark. I didn't stop until I hit a lit gas station. I filled up, sat there in the driver's seat for a long time, and finally let myself breathe. 2 days later, I reported what happened to the local ranger office in Butte. I didn't know what I expected them to do. They took down my information and said they'd send someone to check the area. That was it. I never heard back. I called Todd and told him what I saw. He sounded surprised but not overly concerned. Said it might have been a poacher or a squatter. Said those woods go on forever and plenty of people sneak through. But I know what I felt out there. That pressure, that presence. Somewhere out there in those trees, someone was watching the cabin. Maybe they'd been watching it for days. Maybe they knew someone was inside. Maybe they were waiting for the right moment. I don't go into the woods alone anymore. Not that deep, not that far. And I never stayed in that cabin again. Even now, sometimes when I'm walking Red near my house or sitting alone in the evening, I think about those boot prints in the mud. Whoever it was, they were coming toward me. It was the winter of 2017. I was 33 years old then, and I'd just gone through a pretty rough year. I had been working as a mechanic in Sioux Falls for almost a decade, and out of nowhere, I got laid off. On top of that, my fiancé had called it quits 2 months earlier. Everything just came crashing down in a short period of time. I remember feeling like I didn't belong anywhere anymore, and I was just constantly angry or numb. My cousin Ben offered to let me crash at his house in Des Moines, but I didn't want to be around people. I wanted to disappear for a while. Somewhere quiet, somewhere I wouldn't have to look at anyone. That's how I ended up in a small cabin outside of Babbitt, Minnesota. It was something I found online. A guy was renting it out for dirt cheap because it wasn't in the best shape. Off-grid, no cell service, no running water unless you melted snow or hauled it in from the well down the trail. No neighbors for miles. Just pine trees, frozen lakes, and quiet. Exactly what I was looking for. I drove up there in my old GMC Sierra in early January. It took most of the day because the snow was deep and the last 20 miles were barely maintained forest roads. When I got to the cabin, I immediately understood why the rent was so low. The place was leaning a bit, and there was frost on the inside of the windows. The wood stove worked, though, and I had brought in enough supplies: canned food, a portable battery for light, propane for cooking. I planned to stay for at least 3 weeks. First, everything felt peaceful. I spent my mornings splitting firewood or hiking out onto the frozen lake with my dog, Roxy. She was a 7-year-old black lab, full of energy, always bounding around in the snow like a puppy. We'd take long walks down the snowmobile trails that cut through the forest. I hadn't seen another person in days. At night, I'd sit by the fire, read old magazines I brought along, or just stare into the flames. But that peace didn't last. It started on the 5th night. I had just put more logs on the fire and was brushing Roxy's coat when she suddenly tensed up. Her ears perked, and she bolted to the front door, sniffing and whining. At first, I thought maybe she smelled a fox or a deer, but then she growled low and deep. It wasn't like her. She usually barked at small animals. This time, she stayed quiet, staring at the door like she expected something to come through it. I stepped outside with my flashlight and scanned the treeline. Nothing, just cold air and the faint rustling of branches. Still, the way Roxy acted made me uneasy. I brought her back in, bolted the door, and kept the axe close that night. The next morning, I found boot prints near the back of the cabin. Not mine. They were smaller, narrower, and only a few hours old judging by how crisp the edges were. They came in from the woods, circled the cabin once, and went back out the same way. Whoever it was didn't knock, didn't call out, just walked around my place and left. I don't know why, but I didn't leave right then. Maybe I didn't want to look scared. Maybe I didn't care if something happened to me. I just told myself it could have been a hunter or someone lost on a snowmobile, even though I hadn't heard a motor all week. Still, I started keeping the firewood inside, and I didn't hike as far during the day. 2 days later, I saw him. I was about a mile down the snowmobile trail near a frozen stream. Roxy was off-leash, chasing snowflakes like she always did. I was crouched by the water's edge, trying to break some ice loose to melt later. When I stood up, I saw a figure standing off in the trees, maybe 50 yards back. He wasn't moving, just standing behind a pine, watching. He had on a faded red parka, tan snow pants, and a ski mask. I couldn't see his face. No snowmobile, no snowshoes, no gear that I could see. He was just there. I didn't wave. I didn't shout. I stood still, hoping maybe it was a mirage. Maybe just a tree bent weird in the wind. But it wasn't. After a few seconds, he slowly stepped backward behind the tree and vanished. I called Roxy back and walked straight back to the cabin, trying not to look over my shoulder. That night, I didn't sleep. I kept the fire low so the light wouldn't glow through the windows, and I sat up in the chair with the axe in my lap. Roxy paced the room for hours, ears twitching. In the morning, I found more tracks. This time, they led right up to the woodpile. Some of the logs had been moved, not taken, just shifted around, like whoever it was had been searching for something or just wanted me to know they'd been there. I packed a go bag with food, water, and first aid, just in case I had to make a run for the truck. But the road back was buried in fresh snow, and my truck didn't have chains. I knew I'd probably get stuck if I tried to leave right away. The third night after I saw the guy, things got worse. Around 1 a.m., I woke up to the sound of footsteps on the porch. Not animal footsteps, boots. Roxy was growling softly from the corner. I held my breath and listened. The boards creaked once, twice, and then stopped.
No knock.
No voice. Then I heard the door handle rattle. Just a little, a quiet jiggle, then a pause, then again, like someone was checking if it was locked. I grabbed the axe and moved to the door as quietly as I could, heart pounding so loud it felt like I was underwater. I didn't shout. I didn't make a sound. I just stood there in the dark, holding the axe up and waiting. After a minute or two, the handle stopped moving. I heard the footsteps again, going down the steps and away from the cabin. I waited another 10 minutes before cracking the window and peeking out with my flashlight. I caught a glimpse of him, maybe 30 yards out, standing halfway between the trees and the cabin. He was holding something, long and thin. Could have been a branch, could have been a rifle, couldn't tell. When my light hit him, he ducked down and ran into the woods. I didn't sleep the rest of that night. The fire went out, but I didn't dare get up to stoke it. When the sun finally came up, I made my decision. I was leaving. I didn't care if I got stuck in the snow. I packed everything in 10 minutes and loaded up the truck. Before I left, I took the axe and wedged it in the cabin door to make it look like someone was still inside. But the road out wasn't easy. About 5 miles down, the truck slid into a ditch. I tried digging it out, but the snow was too packed under the tires. I radioed for help on the emergency channel. Luckily, I'd brought a small ham radio with a crank charger. Took nearly 4 hours, but eventually, a plow driver came by. He didn't say anything about it, but I could tell by the way he looked at me that I must have looked like hell. I never went back to that cabin. I never even asked for my deposit back. A few months later, I heard through a local forum that someone else had stayed there and left after 2 nights. They said their snowmobile got sabotaged, fuel line cut, and they saw someone standing in the trees the night before. I don't know who that guy was. Maybe just someone squatting in the woods. Maybe someone who thought that part of the forest belonged to him. But he wasn't just passing through. He knew how to move without leaving much sign. He never spoke, never showed his face, just waited and watched. The scariest part wasn't the footsteps or the door handle. It was the way he didn't seem in a hurry, like he had all the time in the world, like he'd done this before. Now, every winter I still think about that place. When the wind gets loud and the trees groan under the snow, I remember that quiet knock of boots on frozen wood. I remember the way Roxy wouldn't take her eyes off the door. I don't go off-grid anymore. I was 36 the summer I took my dog Max up to a cabin in a narrow, tree-choked valley in western Montana. It was 2019, late August. I'd been living alone for the last year and a half since my divorce from Emily. I had no kids, just Max, a 5-year-old German Shepherd I'd raised from a pup. He was the only constant in my life during that time, the only one that didn't ask questions or give me advice. I needed to clear my head, and I thought a quiet week in the woods would do the trick. The cabin wasn't mine. It belonged to my old coworker Dan, who had retired 2 years ago and spent half his time restoring old motorcycles and the other half drinking beer in a hammock up north. He offered me the place after I told him I needed to get away. It was deep in a lesser-known section of Flathead National Forest, about 12 miles off a gravel road that itself was barely drivable. I packed up the truck with essentials: food, bottled water, a rifle, bear spray, clothes, my old radio, and Max's things. The ride out was long and rough. The gravel road was full of switchbacks and potholes, and trees grew in so tight that branches scraped the sides of the truck. My GPS lost signal halfway up, and I had to rely on the printed map Dan gave me, complete with a couple of greasy fingerprint smudges from his own hands. I arrived around 4 in the afternoon. The cabin was old, built in the late 70s. 1 floor, no basement, cedar siding, green tin roof, and a wraparound porch that looked like it had been repaired too many times. The outhouse was 20 yards out back, half hidden by dense bushes. No running water, no electricity, no cell signal, but it was peaceful. Tall pine trees surrounded the cabin on all sides. The clearing was small, with wild grass that came up to my knees and patches of bare dirt where animals had passed through. A small stream ran down the eastern edge, just a trickle of cold water over smooth rocks. The nearest human was probably 20 miles away. I unlocked the place and stepped inside. Dust in the air, mouse droppings in a few corners, but nothing unexpected. The kitchen had a wood stove and a sink with a hand pump. There was 1 bedroom, a small living room with a dusty couch, and a fold-out table near the window. Max ran in behind me, sniffing everything, tail wagging. I cleaned up quickly and got the place livable. By nightfall, I had a fire going in the stove and Max curled up by the door. I ate canned chili and bread, poured some kibble into Max's bowl, then sat on the porch with a headlamp on, drinking lukewarm beer while listening to the night. The quiet was heavy. No traffic, no planes, not even a breeze. Just insects, distant owl calls, and the occasional crack of a branch somewhere in the trees. I didn't see another set of headlights the entire day. That night, I slept deep and dreamless. The first 2 days passed easily. I hiked a little, read a beat-up paperback, took notes in a journal I brought along. I let Max roam around within earshot. He never wandered far. At night, I kept the lanterns low and the fire warm. I kept the rifle loaded but leaning against the wall. Not because I was scared, just because being out here, that's what you did. The third night, something changed. Started with Max. We were both on the porch around 9. The sun had dropped behind the mountains. The air was getting cold. I was sipping a cup of instant coffee when Max froze and turned his head sharply toward the tree line across the clearing. I paused and looked too, but I didn't hear anything at first. He growled low, deep and steady, not playful. His ears were pinned back. Then I heard it. It was subtle, a single stick crack, not a snap like a squirrel or a bird. More deliberate, more weight, then silence. I stood slowly and went inside, grabbed the rifle and stepped back out. Max hadn't moved. His body was tense. I scanned the trees for movement, but it was too dark to see past the first row. I stayed out there for half an hour listening. Nothing else happened that night. The next morning, I walked the edge of the clearing, looking for prints or signs of animals. Bears, maybe. Moose. But there was nothing. Max sniffed around, following scents I couldn't see. Around the backside of the cabin, near the outhouse, he stopped again and growled low. I walked over and found something odd. There was a small pile of rocks near the base of a tree. 3 flat stones stacked neatly, not far from a path that led down to the stream. It looked out of place, too clean, too intentional. I hadn't noticed it earlier, and I had used the outhouse plenty by that point. It hadn't been there the day before. That much I was sure of. I knocked it over without thinking and kept walking. That night was quieter. No growling from Max, no strange noises. I figured maybe it was an animal that passed through. I stayed up a little later, sitting on the porch, watching the trees. But around midnight, Max started pacing. He walked from the door to the window, back and forth, then stood with his head low, staring at the front of the cabin like he heard something again. I listened, holding my breath. It was too quiet. No wind, no crickets, just that thick silence that made you feel like you had cotton in your ears. Then I heard footsteps, slow, deliberate steps in the dirt, just outside the cabin window on the far side. I turned off the lantern. Max stood by my leg, growling low and steady. I held the rifle and crept to the window. Didn't see anything. I didn't sleep much that night. In the morning, I found more footprints behind the cabin. Barefoot. Human. I followed them 20 feet into the trees. Then they just disappeared. That day, I stayed close to the cabin. I kept the rifle with me even indoors. I filled more water bottles at the stream, took stock of my food, and prepped the truck just in case. I still had 3 more days planned, but I was starting to question if I'd stay. That afternoon, Max barked hard, once, and bolted into the woods. I dropped everything and ran after him. He led me about 200 yards out, through trees and brush, until we reached a small flat spot by the stream. That's where I saw it. Another stack of stones, taller this time, 7 or 8 rocks, perfectly balanced like some weird totem. Next to it was something else, a rabbit skinned and nailed to a tree, the meat left to rot, flies buzzing around it, the fur left hanging below it, swinging in the light breeze. Max barked again and circled wide. I took a few steps back, heart pounding. Someone had done this, and it was recent. I could still see wet blood on the bark. I turned and walked back fast, keeping Max close. I didn't feel safe anymore. That night, I kept all the lamps off, just the fire in the stove. Rifle loaded, bear spray on the table. Max lay at my feet but didn't sleep. Every few minutes, he lifted his head, ears twitching. Around 2 a.m., we heard someone walking. Not running, walking, around the cabin. One slow lap. Max stood up, tail stiff, body rigid. I stayed low, heart hammering. Whoever it was didn't knock, didn't try to get in, just walked around the outside of the cabin once, then disappeared into the trees. I waited till morning, then packed everything. I didn't care if I had days left. I wasn't staying. When I opened the door that morning, there were rocks on the porch. Another little pile, this time with a piece of paper stuck underneath the top stone. I unfolded it with shaking hands. It was a map, hand-drawn, crude lines, a little X marked near the stream, and written in pencil underneath, "Don't disturb what isn't yours." I didn't take anything else from that cabin. I packed fast, threw everything in the truck, and got Max in the passenger seat. I drove out of there without stopping, even when I thought I saw movement in the trees behind me. I didn't tell Dan. I never said a word. I didn't want him thinking I was nuts or accusing me of messing with his place. I just mailed the keys back and said thanks. I never went back. Even now, years later, I think about that map. That paper wasn't weathered. The handwriting was recent. Someone was out there, watching, waiting, not trying to scare me off with violence, but with control. That was worse. Whatever I stumbled into, whether it was some backwoods ritual, someone living off the grid with their own rules, or just a sick individual playing a game, I learned the hard way that the forest doesn't belong to you just because you pitch a tent or rent a cabin. It belongs to whoever's out there long enough to make the rules. And sometimes they don't want to be found.